USS Thresher, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, sank and broke apart during a test dive off Cape Cod. Twisted pieces were later found on the ocean floor.
The crew of the USS Skylark heard only a sickening crunch of metal, then nothing. Deep below, the USS Thresher was gone. The Navy quickly blamed a small silver-brazed pipe. But that was the story they wanted people to believe. The true black box, secret SOSUS recordings, was classified. Now those files are open. They reveal the pipe theory is wrong. The Thresher didn't flood, it went powerless. But the declassified files also hint at something far stranger. From a possible Soviet encounter to phantom ghost signals heard from the wreckage a full day after the implosion. Why the Thresher was a revolution. You see, the Soviets were churning out new classes of submarines. These boomers were nuclear missile-armed boats that could, in theory, park themselves just a few hundred miles off the coast of New York or Washington, D.C. From there, they could launch a barrage of missiles that would end the United States in under 15 minutes. The U.S. Navy was, to put it mildly, desperate for an answer. They needed a hunter-killer. They needed a shark that could hunt these Soviet whales before they ever got close. The Thresher was that shark. Launched in 1961 at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, she was the lead ship of her class, a vessel designed for one single, terrifying purpose: to hunt and destroy enemy submarines. What many overlooked at the time was just how different she was. She didn't look like the old World War II subs. Her hull had a revolutionary new teardrop shape. This design, based on an experimental sub called the USS Albacore, meant she could slice through the water with shocking speed and agility. She was quieter, faster, and more nimble than anything the Soviets had, but the real wow factor was her skin. The Thresher was built using a brand new high-strength alloy called HY80 steel. This wasn't just regular metal. The 80 in its name stood for 80,000 pounds per square inch. That is the amount of force, or yield strength, the steel could take before it even began to permanently deform. This special steel was the key. It allowed Thresher to operate at depths no one had ever dreamed of. Her classified test depth was 1,300 feet. That was nearly twice as deep as previous American submarines. At that depth, the water pressure is a mind-boggling 600 pounds on every single square inch of the hull. A pinhole leak wouldn't just drip, it would blast a jet of water with enough force to cut a man in half. And then there was her hearing. The thing nobody tells you about the Thresher's design is its most incredible feature, the BQQ2 sonar system. This wasn't just a small sensor attached to the front. This was a massive sphere nearly 20 feet across built right into the sub's bow. This giant electronic ear was so sensitive it could detect the faint signature hum of a Soviet reactor or the beat of a propeller from miles away. This sonar sphere was so enormous that it created a design problem. The Navy couldn't fit the torpedo tubes in the bow anymore, so they had to completely redesign the front of the sub, moving the 4 torpedo tubes to the middle of the ship, angled outwards from her sides. This was a radical new design, and it made her a lethal predator. From those tubes, she could fire standard torpedoes. She could fire nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and she could fire the most science fiction weapon of the era, the SUBROC missile. This weapon was pure insanity. It would launch from a torpedo tube silently deep underwater. It would then rocket to the surface, breach the waves, and fly through the air for 30 miles like a ballistic missile. Then it would dive back into the sea right on top of its target and detonate a nuclear warhead. The Thresher was a technological marvel. She was America's silent, deadly, and supposedly invincible answer to the Soviet threat. She was the crown jewel of the fleet. And she was the personal pride of the most powerful and feared man in the Navy, Admiral Hyman Rickover. Rickover was the father of the nuclear Navy. He was a brilliant, demanding, and ruthless man who had, through sheer force of will, created America's entire nuclear fleet. You did not cross Rickover, and you did not question his machines. By early 1963, Thresher had finished her first trials with amazing success. But after a 9-month overhaul at Portsmouth, she had to complete one last set of tests, deep dive trials. These trials would push the submarine to her absolute limits. On April 9, 1963, she headed out from Portsmouth, accompanied by a rescue ship. On board the Thresher were 129 men. This included the highly trained Navy crew, but also civilian engineers and shipyard workers who knew every pipe, weld, and system. For everyone aboard, it was just another day at the office. But this invincible hunter had a secret, one that would make her the world's most expensive coffin. What the Skylark heard. The morning of April 10, 1963 was calm and clear. The Atlantic Ocean, about 220 miles east of Cape Cod, was shining like glass. It was a perfect day for a test. But deep beneath those peaceful waves, the USS Thresher was preparing for the dive that would change naval history forever. On the surface, the submarine rescue ship, the USS Skylark, stayed close. The Skylark was the Thresher's only lifeline, but it was a thin one. The two ships communicated using a special underwater telephone system that sailors called Gertrude. This wasn't a clear digital line like we have today. It was an analog acoustic system. It was full of static, hissing, and echoes, but it was all they had. At 6:30 in the morning, the Thresher contacted the Skylark. The message was simple. The dive was beginning. The plan was careful, almost painfully so. The Thresher would descend slowly in tight spirals, pausing every 100 feet. At each stop, the crew and the civilian technicians would perform a complete check of all systems. They were listening for the tiniest groan from the hull, watching for the smallest leak from a valve. Every weld, every pipe, every seal was under unimaginable stress, and that stress was increasing with every foot they went down. Everything seemed normal. The Thresher passed 500 feet. All checks good. She passed 800 feet. All checks good. She passed 1,000 feet. She was now in the deep, dark crush zone, approaching her test depth of 1,300 feet. The crew on the Skylark listened to each update, their knuckles a little wider. They had special rescue gear on their ship, a diving bell, but they all knew the unspoken truth. At these kinds of depths, their help was almost useless. If anything went truly wrong down there, the Thresher was completely and totally on her own. For almost 3 hours, everything was routine. Then at 9:12 in the morning, the radio operator on the Skylark heard a new message come through the static. The voice from the Thresher was calm, professional, but the words themselves were chilling. Experiencing minor difficulties. Have a positive up angle. Attempting to blow. Let's break that down because every word matters. Minor difficulties could mean anything from a small electrical issue to a tiny leak. It was not a panic call. Have a positive up angle meant the sub was pointing its nose toward the surface, trying to climb. But the last part, attempting to blow, that was the key. Blowing is the main emergency procedure on a submarine. It means the crew was trying to force massive amounts of high-pressure air into the submarine's giant ballast tanks. This air would push the heavy seawater out, making the submarine light and buoyant, causing it to rocket to the surface like a cork. This was not a drill. This was a real emergency. On the Skylark, the crew wasn't panicked yet. They waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 long, agonizing minutes of complete and total silence from the deep. The radio operator on the Skylark called again and again, his voice getting tighter. "Thresher, Thresher, this is Skylark, over." Nothing but static. Finally, at 9:17 a.m., another broken, fragmented message came through the Gertrude. The transmission was awful, almost impossible to understand. It was just garbled noise and then one clear word, 900. After that, the acoustic operators on the Skylark reported hearing a new, terrifying sound. It was described as the sound of rushing air, as if a massive high-pressure hose had been turned on deep in the ocean. Then just 1 minute later, at 9:18 a.m., the operators heard a final, sickening sound. It was a sound that no submariner ever wants to hear. It was described as a deep, crushing, catastrophic crunch, the sound of a massive metal hull failing, an implosion. Then, silence. A profound, endless silence. The Skylark called repeatedly, their voices now desperate. "Thresher, Thresher, this is Skylark, do you read?" Nothing. They searched the surface. They scanned the depths with their sonar. But the Thresher, with its 129 men, its nuclear reactor, and its top-secret weapons, had vanished. By that afternoon, 15 Navy ships were racing to the scene, but they found nothing. No debris field, no oil slick, no survivors. She was just gone. The United States had lost its most advanced weapon, but what no one realized at that moment was that this was only the beginning of a much deeper mystery. The Navy needed answers, and they needed them immediately. The search for the truth would begin, and so would the cover-up. What SOSUS recorded. The loss of the Thresher sent a shockwave through the Pentagon and the White House. To lose a submarine was a tragedy. To lose the Thresher, the most advanced, most expensive, and most powerful submarine ever built, was a national security crisis. The pressure to find out what happened was immense, not just from the public, but from the very top of the military. The search for the Thresher's remains became one of the most intense deep-sea operations in history. For months, specialized ships scanned a massive search area. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, miles wide and thousands of feet deep. The Navy deployed everything it had. The research vessel Mizar used precision sonar systems to map the ocean floor. Finally, in June of 1964, more than a year after the disaster, they found it. The remains of the Thresher lay scattered across the seabed at a staggering depth of 8,400 feet. The once mighty submarine had been torn into 6 major pieces. The wreckage told a chilling story of a catastrophic implosion. Here's a wow factor for you. The physics of that implosion are hard to even imagine. The pressure at that depth is almost 4,000 pounds per square inch. The Thresher's hull was designed to withstand maybe 2,400 feet at most. When it passed that limit, the hull didn't just crack or leak, it collapsed inward in a fraction of a second. The energy released from the imploding air inside the sub would have heated it to hotter than the surface of the sun for a single microsecond. The 129 men on board were lost instantly, before their brains could even register that something was wrong. The Navy's bathyscaphe, the Trieste, was sent down to photograph the wreck. The images were horrifying. The hull was crushed like a tin can. The massive sail was ripped off. Debris was scattered everywhere. But to the Navy's immense relief, the reactor compartment seemed to be intact. There were no signs of a radiation leak that could have caused an environmental disaster. Now that they had the wreck, the Naval Court of Inquiry had to deliver a verdict. And they delivered one fast. The pressure was on to find a simple, understandable, and most importantly, non-nuclear explanation. And they found one. The court's final conclusion, the one that went into the history books, blamed a pipe. Specifically, a saltwater pipe in the engine room that had failed at a joint. This wasn't a strong welded joint, it was a joint held together by something called silver-brazing. Think of it like a type of high-strength solder. These silver-brazed joints were known weak points, and the Thresher had hundreds of them. Here is the official story the Navy told the world for 60 years. At test depth, one of these silver-brazed joints ruptured. High-pressure seawater began spraying into the engine room like a high-velocity fire hose. This saltwater spray hit the main electrical panels, causing a massive short circuit. This in turn caused an immediate reactor scram, an emergency shutdown of the nuclear reactor. The Thresher was now dead in the water with no power and taking on water. The crew, just as they'd said, tried the emergency ballast blow. But, and this is the killer detail, the system failed. The official theory was that as the high-pressure air rushed through the pipes, it expanded rapidly. This rapid expansion, called the Joule-Thomson effect, caused moisture in the lines to freeze instantly, creating ice plugs that blocked the system. With no power and a failed emergency system, the submarine was just a heavy steel tube. It sank deeper and deeper until it passed its crush depth and was obliterated. This story was clean. It blamed the shipyard, Portsmouth, for bad brazing. It didn't blame the revolutionary nuclear reactor or its complex electrical systems. The Navy immediately launched the SubSafe program, a massive billion-dollar overhaul of how submarines are built. And it worked. No SubSafe certified sub has ever been lost. But it was a lie. You see, there was a black box, but it wasn't on the Thresher, it was on the ocean floor. It was called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. This was America's top-secret ears of the Atlantic, a massive network of underwater microphones laid out to listen for Soviet subs. And on April 10, 1963, SOSUS was listening. It recorded everything. A young analyst named Lieutenant Bruce Rule was one of the men who studied those tapes. And what he found chilled him to the bone. It completely contradicted the Court of Inquiry's story. Here's what the black box revealed. What he didn't hear was any sound of a pipe bursting. There was no whoosh of high-pressure flooding before the disaster. But what he did hear was even worse. He heard the unmistakable sound of the electrical bus failing first. At 9:11 a.m., the electrical system that powered the main coolant pumps sputtered and died. This is what caused the reactor to scram. The Thresher didn't lose power because it flooded. It flooded because it lost power and then imploded. The crew was powerless, in the dark, in a silent submarine sinking uncontrollably into the abyss. The flooding and broken pipes were a result of the implosion, not the cause of the sinking. When Rule testified, he was attacked. He later said that members of the court, admirals, pressured him to change his findings to fit their flooding theory. Why? 2 reasons. First, you cannot reveal SOSUS to the world. It was the nation's biggest secret. Second, you cannot blame Admiral Rickover's nuclear electric plant. It was politically impossible. So, they buried the truth. For 50 years, Rule's data was hidden until a lawsuit forced the Navy to open the vault. What if it wasn't an accident? The official story, the silver-brazed pipe, was neat and tidy. It blamed a simple mechanical failure. But as Bruce Rule's real analysis began to leak out over the decades, it became clear the Navy was hiding something. And when you have a cover-up of this magnitude, it creates a vacuum. A vacuum that gets filled, to put it mildly, with some very wild theories. For 60 years, the Thresher families and amateur sleuths asked, if the pipe story was a lie, what really happened down there? And what was so bad that the Navy had to hide it? It all came to a head in 2019. A retired Navy captain named James Bryant, who had commanded 3 Thresher-class submarines himself, had read Bruce Rule's analysis and knew it was the truth. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get the documents. The Navy stonewalled him, claiming national security. So Captain Bryant did what you do in America. He sued the federal government. He was joined by the families of the lost crew, including Joy McMillan, whose father, Walter Jack Nunez, had perished on the Thresher. They had lived their entire lives with the Navy's incomplete story. In 2020, a federal judge finally agreed. He ordered the Navy to open the vault and release the 3,600 pages of hidden files. And those files confirmed Rule's analysis. It was an electrical failure. The Navy had lied. With the official story now proven false, it opened the door to all the theories that the lie was created to hide. Wild theory number 1, a Soviet attack. This is the big one. You have to remember the time, April 1963. This was the absolute peak of the Cold War. The Thresher was America's #1 strategic asset, and she was on the surface, then diving in a predictable test pattern. She was a sitting duck. The theory goes that a Soviet November-class hunter-killer submarine, possibly the K-27, was shadowing her. This was standard cat-and-mouse practice, but something went wrong. Maybe the Soviet sub got too close and they collided in the deep. Or maybe, in a terrifying game of chicken, the Soviet sub fired a warning torpedo that accidentally hit its mark. If this happened, the Navy would have an impossible choice. Admitting a Soviet submarine had destroyed their best boat would be an act of war. It would be the start of World War III. The president would be forced to retaliate and the nuclear missiles would fly. So what do? You cover it up. You blame a pipe. You sacrifice the truth from 129 families to save the world from annihilation. The wow factor here is that this cover-up in this scenario is almost heroic. The evidence against this is that the SOSUS tapes, the black box, apparently showed no sound of a second submarine or a torpedo explosion. But then again, the Navy still hasn't released the full raw tapes. They've only released the analysis. What are they still hiding? Wild theory number 2. Sabotage. This one is almost scarier. If it was an electrical failure, as Bruce Rule proved, was it an intentional one? Remember, the Thresher wasn't just crewed by Navy sailors. There were 129 men on board, and many were civilian contractors from the Portsmouth shipyard. What if one of them was a Soviet agent, a Manchurian candidate who had been planted years earlier waiting for the perfect moment? Think about it. An electrical failure is the perfect act of sabotage. It's clean, it's quiet, there's no explosion. You just flip the wrong switch or short the right bus at the sub's test depth and the ocean does the rest. It's a perfect, untraceable way to neutralize America's #1 weapon. If the Navy even suspected this, it would be the greatest intelligence failure in U.S. history. Admitting a Soviet spy had penetrated their most secure shipyard and gotten onto their most advanced sub? Unthinkable. They would have to blame a pipe. Wild theory. Number 3. A secret test gone horribly wrong. This theory points the finger back at Admiral Rickover. Was the Thresher testing more than just her depth? We know she was armed with the SUBROC missile. Was she testing a live fire of this new unstable weapon? What if it malfunctioned in the tube and crippled the ship? Or what if they were testing a new risky maneuver with the reactor itself? Pushing it to its absolute limit, trying a hot restart or some other procedure that Rickover had authorized? If Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, had approved a dangerous and unsanctioned test that got 129 men lost, his entire nuclear program would be over. The Navy and the politicians who backed him would have to protect him at all costs. Blaming a bad pipe was the perfect out. It saved the entire nuclear fleet. All of these theories were what the Navy was hiding. The truth of the electrical failure was bad enough, but what it implied was even worse. But the most disturbing theory of all came from the declassified logs themselves. A ghost in the water. The final horrifying truth. The declassified documents from Captain Bryant's lawsuit confirmed the cover-up. They proved Bruce Rule's acoustic analysis was correct. An electrical failure, not a flood, doomed the Thresher. But as researchers and families sifted through the thousands of newly released pages, they found something else. They found a log buried in the files that is so chilling, so hard to explain, that it has become the darkest part of the Thresher mystery. This is the part that is far worse than expected. The logs came from the USS Seawolf, another nuclear hunter-killer submarine that arrived on the scene to help search for the missing Thresher. The Seawolf arrived on April 11, 1963. This is a critical detail. It was more than 24 full hours after the SOSUS network recorded the Thresher's final catastrophic implosion at 9:18 a.m. on April 10th. According to Bruce Rule's ironclad data, the Thresher was gone. It was destroyed and all 129 men were lost instantly. But the Seawolf's logs tell a different story. On April 11th, the Seawolf's sonar operators began hearing strange underwater sounds. They weren't the normal groans of a shifting wreck. The log described them as signals. The crew of the Seawolf, desperate to find survivors, began to believe they were hearing men alive tapping on the inside of the Thresher's hull. This went on for hours. The tapping was faint, but it was rhythmic. The Seawolf crew became so convinced that they were hearing survivors that they did something heartbreaking. They broadcasted a message into the deep using their own Gertrude underwater telephone. The declassified log recorded their transmission. "We hear your underwater telephone. If you will send 5 dashes, we will have positive identification. Send 5 dashes. This is the ultimate WTF moment. The Thresher was at the bottom of the ocean, 8,400 feet down, completely obliterated by an implosion that exerted 4,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. It was physically impossible for anyone to be alive. So, what was the Seawolf hearing? This is where we have to talk down to earth, as the people watching this are looking for the truth. The most likely rational explanation is a grim one. The Thresher's wreck was massive, twisted, and unstable. It was settling on the ocean floor. Trapped air from compartments was escaping, rising, and making noise. Metal was groaning and shifting. These sounds, pings, groans, tapping, were just the sounds of a destroyed ship. The Seawolf crew, in a desperate and emotional state, interpreted these random sounds as signals. It's a phenomenon called auditory pareidolia, hearing what you desperately want to hear, but then there's the other possibility, the one that, as the SOPs say, is credible fiction but taps into the core mystery. The Thresher was over 270 feet long. What if the entire sub didn't implode at once? What if the catastrophic failure happened in the rear, in the engine room and the forward compartments, the torpedo room, the control room, miraculously sealed and held just for a few more hours? What if a handful of men, 10, maybe 15, survived the initial implosion trapped in a pocket of air? They would be in total darkness. The temperature of the water at that depth is near freezing. The hull around them would be groaning and cracking. They would be at 8,400 feet with no power, no heat, and a limited supply of air. They would know with absolute certainty that rescue was impossible. They would be the deepest, most isolated humans in history waiting for the end. In this horrifying scenario, the tapping was real. It was their final hopeless message to the world, a desperate "we are here," heard by the Seawolf a day later. This is a truth that is in its own way far worse than a quick instant end. And there is one final wild theory. What if the signals the Seawolf heard were not from the Thresher at all? What if it was the Soviet sub, the one from theory number 1, which had returned to the wreck site to monitor the American search? What if the Seawolf was accidentally communicating with the very people who had caused the disaster? The thing is, we still don't know for sure, because the Navy, even after the lawsuit, still has not released the most important files. The raw acoustic data, the lophograms, the actual sounds of the Thresher's end are still classified. We have Bruce Rule's analysis, but not the tapes. What is on those tapes that is still so sensitive 60 years later? Is it the sound of a second submarine, the sound of an internal explosion, or the sound of something else, something that proves the Thresher's loss wasn't an accident, but an act of war? So, was the Navy's 60-year-old lie a necessary secret to prevent World War III, or was it a cold-blooded betrayal of the 129 men who died? Let me know what you think in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe for more declassified mysteries.